Good morning. I'm going to talk you through the conclusion and explain some things that are going to be a little different about this conclusion than other essays you've written, much in the same way that the introduction was a little bit different. In the introduction, you were asked to make a personal connection, something from your own experience that dealt with the question of blame or helped you define what makes somebody blameworthy. The conclusion is going to make a connection to a modern story. And by story, I mean that rather broadly. It could be a modern song, film, television show, another book that you've read, or any other narrative, any other story that comes from contemporary or modern culture. So let's look at the steps. I've outlined those in the attached document. So for the conclusion, you'll start by considering how the question of blame and responsibility is still on the mind of today's artists. You're going to make a connection to a modern source that you feel addresses the question. This could be a TV show, a film, another book, a song, etc. And you're answering the question, what is the modern author's opinion on the topic? How does it compare to Shakespeare's? Finally, you'll tie back to your own initial feelings on what makes someone blameworthy. So is blame worthiness, is fault or responsibility the same in the contemporary work that you connect to the story? Is it different? It doesn't have to be the same idea. Blame could be a different sort of thing in the piece that you connect to. How has this play, Romeo and Juliet, and the modern piece reinforced or challenged and expanded your perspective on the topic of fault or blame? What are you left thinking now that you hadn't considered before? So those are some guiding questions for what you might address in the conclusion. Here's a step-by-step guide. So step one, write a few sentences summing up and explaining the importance of where your analysis left off. What conclusions are you left with after looking at all your evidence? So this would be concluding the Romeo and Juliet argument. What's your final takeaway from that? Tie up the argument about the blameworthiness of the character you've chosen. So the step one sentences should be about Romeo and Juliet. They should be wrapping up your Romeo and Juliet argument. Step two, you're going to use a transitional sentence to introduce and explain the connection between your blame argument and the modern source. So it could be something to the effect of like, similarly, in the TV show Lost, blame is also a matter of ego. That would be a connection in which it's sort of a comparable situation. Or you could say, unlike Romeo and Juliet, in the movie Minority Report, blame is defined as a lack of awareness for consequences. So the source doesn't need to say the same thing as your argument or your personal opinion in the introduction. It could have a completely different perspective on what makes someone blameworthy. So it could be different character traits that have made the person blameworthy that aren't necessarily the same as the ones that you looked at in Romeo and Juliet. It could just be a different idea of blame that is not, maybe rooted in specific character traits, but maybe is rooted in fate or circumstances or whatever. So it could be different. It could be the same. Step three, a little context for the outside source. Who's the author? What's the title? What's the year it was published? So if it was a film, what year did it come out? If it was a TV show, when was it aired? If it was a song, who wrote it or what band performed it? So other details that are relevant to the connection that you're making. A little bit of summary, just a little bit of, context so we understand what's happening in the source. You don't have to retell the whole thing, but, what's the blame connection that you can provide context for. Fourth step, you're going to explain how your outside source connects to the play and to Shakespeare's ideas about blame and responsibility. Be as specific as possible. If you can reference specific quotes, that's great. So it might be a comparable connection. It might be something in which an entirely different perspective is revealed than Shakespeare. That's fine, but you're going to do a little thinking about how the idea in the modern source relates to the play. And finally, the last step has your view on the topic. Go back to your original introduction in which you've thought about, based on your perspective, what makes somebody blameworthy or at fault. Has that changed? Stayed the same? And you might reflect on how this applies to the world. Why is this important to talk about? Why is this a matter worth investigating? What's significant besides the stories, but what's significant about this idea to the experience of being human? And that's it. So the you have to spend the most time just thinking about what's a source that you can use, what's a modern story that involves the question of responsibility or blame. Do a little brainstorming on that, and then just follow through the steps. It'll probably run about half a page, in that neighborhood, double spaced. Okay, if you have any questions, just type a comment, or you can always reach out to me on email.